Welcome to the first evidence session, public evidence session of the new Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. I'm Florence Shalomi, I'm the chair of this committee. We are discussing a really important issue this morning on looking at children in temporary accommodation and trying to get a better understanding of how the impact this is having on children and families and what pressures our local authorities are facing. We've got two excellent panels before us this morning. We've got our first panel and then we'll have the second panel at 10:45. Can I start by asking our guests to just introduce themselves, please?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me. Emma Haddad, I'm the Chief Executive of St Mungo's.
Hi, I'm Laura Neilson. I'm a doctor and I lead the Shared Health Foundation.
Hi, I'm Francesca Albanese. I'm the Director of Policy and Social Change at CARIS.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Walker. I'm the Director of CARIS Families, which works with families in hostels in London boroughs.
Thank you very much. I'm sure you've all seen some of the figures around this. So it's estimated that over 150,000 children are currently living in temporary accommodation in England. Can I ask the panel, what do you think has caused this massive increase?
So, thank you. Just a caveat before I start, we don't actually support children and families in our services in St Mungo's, but I can talk more broadly. And because our clients are impacted by temporary accommodation just as much. We're seeing several things. So there's been quite a stark difference in the last couple of years in the number of clients approaching us who are still in employment, yet they're, with cost of living and the increases in rent, they just haven't been able to keep a roof over their head. And so they've either lost their tenancy, lost their house, and approached the council or found other kind of temporary accommodation solution, sometimes given up their home deliberately to go and sleep in their car closer to work because they can't afford to commute. At the same time, you've got people who have usually homelessness and them ending up in some kind, either rough sleeping or temporary accommodation is the end point. And pretty much every client we see has been through some kind of pathway, usually interacting with the public services system. So they've either been through the criminal justice system, or they've experienced domestic abuse, or they've been in the care system, they're a care leaver, the immigration system, the benefit system. They've always impacted with one or more or all of those. All of that has impacted to get to the end point of losing their home, hence massive increase in people finding themselves homeless and in temporary accommodation. And then my third point would be what we're seeing is a system that's completely silted up. So you've got more and more people becoming homeless, either rough sleeping at the very sharp end of that or homeless more broadly. Harder and harder to help them into something temporary, away from the streets, away from danger, or away finding some kind of roof over their heads for them, because the temporary accommodation is so full up. And the temporary accommodation is so full up because it's harder and harder to help people to move on and find something more settled for them. Every one of my services, the first thing the teams will say to me is the biggest challenge at the moment is finding places to help people to move on. And that is predominantly because there's a drastic shortage in social housing, as we know. There's a severe shortage in supported housing, and a lot of people need supported housing before independent living. And then the private rented sector is absolutely unaffordable and inappropriate in many cases, particularly for clients with complex needs, but more generally as well, particularly for clients and families on low incomes where LHA rates housing benefits just not kept up with rent.
Francesca, you wanted to...
Yeah, so just building on Emma's points, I think fundamentally what's driving this is the housing crisis. So we've seen over decades a lack of supply of social housing, but also particularly in the last 5 years, private rents have gone up. And so what we're finding particularly at the low end of the market is that local housing allowance is not meeting the cost of rents, and there hasn't been a review of the benefit cap. Whilst there has been a temporary uplift since April, that's going to end in April 2025 on local housing allowance, and it's going to kind of cause more issues in this space. I think as well as the kind of overall numbers that you've already cited, we know that particularly households with children are spending longer in temporary accommodation. So at the moment in London, over over 60% of households with children have been in temporary accommodation for 2 years or more. So it's kind of like there's this like layering of issues, pushing people into homelessness in the first place because of the cost of living crisis and the housing affordability issues. But fundamentally, councils have no other option than to place people in temporary accommodation. We do a series called the Homelessness Monitor where we've tracked this over 14 years. It is getting worse. Local authorities have cited this in surveys, and we know that for many people there aren't any other options, and that's why we're seeing kind of more expensive temporary accommodation used. And my final point is, when we look at the amount of money that was spent last year, £2.3 billion on temporary accommodation, over 50% of that expenditure is on bed and breakfast and nightly paid accommodation, because that is fundamentally now pushing people into kind of that short-term accommodation. Whilst we know that temporary accommodation is wide-ranging, we're seeing more and more kind of expensive forms, short-term temporary accommodation, and that is also exacerbating the issues.
Mm-hmm. Can I just give a picture locally? So particularly families with children, often they don't come through a different system. So most of our mums who are living in temporary accommodation with children haven't come through the criminal justice system. It comes out of the blue. It's coming for an increasingly wide range of demographics of families who experience children in temporary accommodation. So everything that everyone else has said is true about the housing market. We're also seeing a couple of interesting trends locally, which is that local landlords are switching accommodation from social private rent into temporary accommodation because they can get higher payments from the council. So they'll evict a family from their property, change it into temporary accommodation and move another family into that property for higher rent. And we're seeing that reasonably often. To manage your temporary accommodation locally, you need to have it as a joined up city region or a regional thing, because we see families being shunted from local authority to local authority increasingly more commonly. And children enter temporary accommodation, it's never the children's decision. I think it's really important that, as we talk about Children's Day, we have the children's voice at the heart of this. A lot of children end up in temporary accommodation because of family breakdown, out of the blue rent evictions, parents losing jobs, the gig economy suddenly shifting locally, or 0-hour contracts. And often, and sometimes it's because of other circumstances such as illness. So we are seeing families who were doing okay, and then one parent gets a significant diagnosis, and then they end up in temporary accommodation, which means you've got children in temporary accommodation who are often coping with moving multiple times, moving schools, but also significant issues going with their parents. It's important for the panel to understand that most parents are trying their best. Most parents actually are working incredibly hard to try and sort the situation out, and most don't have significant kind of addiction issues or criminal justice issues when they enter temporary accommodation. What we do see is a massive deterioration in parental mental health in temporary accommodation, which is understandable, and that impacts the children as well.
Just on that then, because I think all of you have touched on such a big issue on that, the government have set up the task force on ending homelessness, led by the Deputy Prime Minister. And have you, any of your organisations you know of, had any engagement from the Deputy Prime Minister's office on this? And do you feel that the government is taking this as a real priority? Becca?
I've really not had any engagement from government on that.
So actually I had the pleasure of chatting to the Deputy Prime Minister yesterday. She came to visit one of our services, which was really good, and talked to her about this. I believe she's meant to chair the first meeting of the interministerial task force this week, and some of us have been invited to join an expert group which will report to that task force, which is due to meet for the first time next week. Yeah, ministerial this week, expert group next week. She's deliberately taking a cross-government approach because it feels like, as we've been talking about, she understands this has to be cross-government. So many people's route crosses different areas of government policy or public policy. I believe the expert group is going to be relatively small, but then they want to task us with going off and looking into different topics further and pulling in other people, both with lived experience and with expertise.
Rebecca, from your work and stuff, what would you want this cross-government department to look like, and in terms of having meat on the bone?
So, from my perspective, and I would obviously reiterate everything the other panellists have said, but particularly what Laura's point around, this is happening to ordinary families, and when I say ordinary, that means families who are earning less than £80,000 a year. That's the average income estimated to be able to rent a 2-bed flat privately in Camden and Hackney, the two boroughs we work in. So this isn't, you can't even really call it low-income families. It's just the vast majority of families, particularly hit, as Laura said, if there's then relationship breakdown and there's a single salary coming in. For us, a cross-governmental task force really should be looking at raising the LHA rates so that they are realistically in line with median rents, because they have been frozen since 2013 and people cannot find flats that are rentable at that rate. I think there should also be some scrutiny around the fact that there's nothing to stop landlords discriminating against families claiming DSS. You know, if you find a flat in an area that is within the LHA rate, most of the time there will be a stipulation no DSS, and that is blocking, you know, majority of families out of the rental market. So I think those are two issues that should really be looked at in terms of the private rented sector.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to come in, Lou?
Yeah, just on the no DSS, because obviously it's a guaranteed income source, more than in effect if someone was employed who, you know, could lose their job tomorrow and then not get a paycheck at the end of the month. So what do you think the stigma is with landlords around DSS? Do you think it's concern about condition of property that stops them from having DSS?
It's a good question. I think it's one that should go to landlord groups.
Yeah.
My feeling is it's just a very old stigma, and as you say, it seems nonsensical to me because it's a far more guaranteed form of income than anyone in employment. I don't know if the rest of the panel have any more views as well.
Actually, the irony is you see both. You see no DSS, and then you see landlords who will only take you if you're on housing benefit. Yeah. And so we have to try and encourage our clients not to work at some points to just get the flat. So,
thank you for that.
So sorry, just to pick on that. So you have to encourage people not to work to be able to get a property?
Well, so whether we're actively encouraging them is probably an exaggeration, but they know that to get a property, they're better off to stay on housing benefit because a landlord won't take them otherwise in some cases.
And that's not the case where they pay the rent.
They know it's a guaranteed income limit. So
I think that is more of a London issue than the rest of the country.
Yeah,
it could be.
Yeah. Just private rent. Okay, thank you. We're going to move on to quality of temporary accommodation. Chris.
Thank you, Chair. So just starting off, would you say temporary accommodation is always a safe environment for families with children?
So we know that temporary accommodation means a lot of things, first of all. So you can have bed and breakfast overnight, you can be staying in a Premier Inn, you can be staying in some form of flat. What we know from the research that we've done with the APPG on temporary accommodation is that a lot of the temporary accommodation is deeply unsuitable for children. So if you think about living in a Premier Inn room or other hotels and you've got a couple of children, first of all, there's no access to cooking facilities, there's no access to laundry facilities, and there's nowhere to play. So we see children who are living in very, very small spaces struggling with milestones, basic things like learning to crawl, learning to walk, because there is no physical space for them. A lot of overnight accommodation says you have to leave in the morning, and then what do you do with your children? And you're waiting to be allocated another place that night by the local authority, and effectively you're just left to kind of roam around and work out what you do. We know that in temporary accommodation we've seen, I work 1 day a week in A&E, and just from my one experience, which is a very small amount of clinical time, in the last year I've seen a child with a femur fracture, a child with a skull fracture, a child with significant burns, and lots of children with respiratory conditions, all of it caused by their social conditions that they're living in. We see temporary accommodation that doesn't have basics of cots and stair gates and radiator covers. So we've got the physical safety. We've also got the psychological safety that's going on in these places. One of the things I've been asking for a long time would be a government guidance that we do not mix family accommodation and single homelessness for men accommodation. They are two hyper vulnerable groups. They are two groups who need our support society. They should not mix. And particularly at the moment when we are doing early release from prisons, I have concern that we are releasing a lot of people from prison with no pathway for accommodation, and they're ending up in the same accommodation as our families. Most of our families are relatively young women with children, often come from domestic violence backgrounds, often very, very vulnerable. And when we asked for evidence of the APPG, we saw a lot of stories from across the whole country. It wasn't regional at all, about women ending up in temporary accommodation where there was drug dealing, criminality, propositioned, and asked to enter into sex contracts. This is not a safe place to bringing up children. It's solvable and it's not a cost issue. It's a logistical issue about how things are allocated, but it's not particularly a cost issue. And it's one that I would like to see the government look at properly and address. It can be done quite quickly, we think. So when we talk about safety, we talk about physical safety, we talk about psychological safety, and we also talk about life chances of safety. So we know that children miss out on education, miss out on health, miss out on lots of other interaction with public services when they enter temporary accommodation. And we will need to consider that when we talk about our children safe in temporary accommodation.
Can I just ask on that, but you say it's an allocation issue rather than a cost issue. I suppose, what would you see then as the barriers to that not being allocated effectively as things currently are if it's not cost?
So my sympathy is for the local authority housing officers. I work very closely with them, and across the country they are extremely stressed. They are very tired, and they feel like they're in a thankless job often where they can't solve the problem because of all the things we've already talked about. And so you are faced with having to find somewhere for a family at short notice. But because the system isn't allocated from the beginning in the ways that we do with lots of other services that we offer, families just end up placed where there happens to be a space. And there isn't risk assessment done, there isn't safeguarding consideration done, that's not standard practice. So there's literally like, if there's a space, the family can go there. Rather than it being thought about is this appropriate? The other thing I'd encourage local authorities to do is visit the places they're putting families in temporary accommodation. If you go and visit, you get a very different impression from if you just talk to the landlord. And so once you visit, you can sense that if it's a safety check. So it's a different way of allocating accommodation, and it would take a bit of change for local authorities. And I know that it's a thing that they possibly feel is another ask. But I think when you look at the impact on children, particularly, and women, it's something we should really be considering and driving through.
Can I just add to that? I work in 2 London boroughs, one which mixes singles and families, and the other one doesn't and keeps them separate. And the atmospheres in the family-only hostels are night and day difference in terms of that impact on those families. They feel much safer, and it has other knock-on effects. For example, we find a lot in the mixed hostels. Those hostels have introduced no visitors policies because there's so much chaotic goings on, mainly as a result of the single adults. But then those no visitor policies impact on the families. It means parents can't draw on the support network they have. It further isolates them. We have mothers who've just given birth who aren't allowed people in to look after their older child while they recover. We also have separated parents who are unable to get proper contact with their child who's non-resident because of these laws, and it makes it feel incredibly carceral in the hostels. It just further isolates people, and that is very much a knock-on effect of, I think, of the mixed tenure hostels. But also there is evidence from councils that do manage to separate it successfully.
On the specific point, Lewis.
Just on that then, what representations have you made then to the council that doesn't, to ask them to do, and what have they, if you have, why have they said they can't do that?
I think the council that doesn't do it it's just far much more demand. They're seeing a lot more homeless singles and families come through their doors every day, and I think their view is that, as Dr. Neilson touched on, they're under such pressure, they just feel like they have to have as many units as possible available on a given day to slot anybody into. Now, it should be a numbers question that, however many units they have across however many hostels, is the same, whether some are just allocated for singles and some are just allocated for families. But I feel it probably makes them feel like they have more flexibility because they haven't got empty rooms in a particular hostel because they haven't had families that day, or empty rooms in another hostel because they haven't had singles that day.
Back to you, Chris.
Thanks. I suppose at the moment, do you think most local authorities are meeting their statutory guidance to ensure temporary accommodation is suitable for families?
So I think local authorities are in a really difficult situation, as we've heard, because there's just not enough stock. So there's definitely issues where families are staying in bed and breakfast for longer than the 6 weeks. We've definitely heard that, and that is because there just isn't enough accommodation full stop. So therefore, we are seeing, and you'll hear in the next session in far more detail around kind of what local authorities are doing. There's a real mixed picture. I think one of the things, to bring it back to kind of one of the earlier questions that you asked around what's the government doing on this and kind of what the opportunities are, at the moment this is an urgent issue, as which is why you kind of brought it to the committee, in terms of we need to fix the issues with temporary accommodation. And clearly we've heard from both Laura and Rebecca about the kind of real impacts that has on families day to day and how horrible and awful that is. But ultimately we've got to look at the whole system. So if we only look at temporary accommodation, and yes, local authorities, in some areas will be breaching regulation, in other areas they won't be. But we've also got to look at what's driving that. So there's a real opportunity for kind of interministerial group across government strategy sharing outcomes and kind of what is it that we want the homelessness system to look like, over the medium to long term. There's definitely things we can do now to fix that, to make sure families aren't placed in dangerous situations, but it's also that kind of long-term vision and making sure that we have kind of a focus across all the different areas that are driving homelessness. And ultimately we also have a commitment for a housing plan. That's really positive. Let's join the two together so that we're designing a system where we want, that is actually what local authorities want to do and how they want to design and place households in it, not something where we're kind of firefighting all the time.
I would like to see there be a floor, like the lowest standard acceptable for temporary accommodation, and that is not very clear at the moment. So, and I would like the government to consider what is reasonable. Is a caravan reasonable to bring up your children in the middle of January? Is a converted office block reasonable? Is moving from one B&B to another B&B to another B&B so that every 4 or 5 weeks you move, is that reasonable? Is it reasonable? One of the families I saw last week had moved 7 times in 3 weeks through different hotels across the city region, and then the mum had been fined for school attendance. Like, is that reasonable? At what point, how long do you live without cooking facilities? How long do you live without laundry facilities? How long do you live without being able to have a visitor? I think there needs to be a floor on what is the lowest that we will accept as society for temporary accommodation, and they don't have to be the same as our decent home standards, but because I know that is tricky in the political realm, but there does I would appreciate some kind of floor in this area.
No, thank you for that, Chris. Just moving on to, you've all touched on it, the issue around B&B, temporary accommodation. Sarah?
Challenges do families face when they are placed in hotels and bed and breakfast temporary accommodation for the extended periods that you've described?
So a lot of it's to do with logistics. So often they are travelling quite a long way. Simple things like getting to school is tricky. The children are entitled to free bus passes, but it's really difficult to get them. The adults aren't. So often the adults can't afford to get the kids to school. And then just the time. If you're going to school and you're travelling an hour and a half, 2 hours, there's definitely something about cooking. There's definitely something about food. There's definitely something about being moved repeatedly. So one of the biggest psychological factors that families talk about is the fact that they just remain packed all the time because they could get told that day they're moving somewhere else. And that happens for quite long periods of time. So it's really unsettling for families. And children have talked to us about going to school and then coming home and going to a different home and then going to school and being moved again. And so at school they're very worried about what will happen, where are they going that night, and that's something they talk about. When we talk to our children who live in temporary accommodation, ask them what do they want, they all say a home. So if you say something like what do you want for Christmas, they don't say Xbox or trainers or anything else that like maybe your kids are asking for or mine are, but they say I want a home. And the other thing they talk about quite a lot, which is interesting, is just normal things that other children do, friends over, pets, hamsters, cats, like very normal school children things is what they want. And none of that is possible in temporary accommodation. And we've got families, I'm sure you've got families as well, who've been in TA for 2-3 years, moving repeatedly.
I suppose the only thing I would add to that is obviously there's a lack of access to support, primarily when you're in bed and breakfast accommodation compared to maybe more kind of other forms of temporary accommodation like private sector leased homes or kind of homes from housing associations or kind of other social tenancies, and that obviously does have an impact in terms of what people can access. also thinking about how people move out of that situation. We've already mentioned kind of the impact on children, but there is a real stark impact in terms of having nowhere to do homework. I've did some research a while ago, but things have got worse, and that was really, I saw a child doing their homework on a cardboard box. And we know from research that others have done, including Shelter, that's not changed, and there really is some quite stark impacts in terms of educational outcomes and kind of what that means in terms of kind of for the family, but the children, and kind of we know as well that quite a stark indicator of experiencing homelessness later on in life is if you've experienced it as a child.
And we also know that these children are very hidden from other public sector services. So one of the things that the APPG is trying to do is the notification system, but that's because in the healthcare system doesn't count children living in temporary accommodation. In the NHS we don't code in any way. So if you go to A&E you're not asked. If you go to GPs you're not asked. So we don't have any accident data, we don't have any admission data locally or nationally because we haven't asked it. And similarly in education, we haven't got in the missingness cohort, we don't know how many of those children are missing because they're in temporary accommodation. It's something that isn't asked locally or nationally. And so because we don't have that information, I think that is also a hole that's not helping us shape our policy and our response.
Did you want to come in, Chris?
Schools have come up a couple of times, but in B&Bs, but in temporary accommodation across the boards. Apart from, you mentioned the free bus passes for the children, is there any other support that local authorities or the schools tend to give in order to support kids getting to school?
So it's really dependent on schools, and there's evidence of really good practice. So one of the reasons of saying let's try and do a national notification system is because schools have said if they know they can help. So we've got schools in Greater Manchester. The Manchester Communications Academy has been absolutely brilliant at pioneering how do you support children in temporary accommodation. And once you tell them, they've got a wraparound system to support that child. And then things like behaviour codes and being late and being sanctioned for not having your PE kit and being sanctioned for not quite managing to do your science homework on time, the school adopt a more reasonable approach. What we know is that children and families don't tell schools themselves. They feel so ashamed that they just hide it. But some schools don't offer that wraparound at all. So that's a piece of work we'd like to do with the education department about what does best practice look like in supporting children in temporary accommodation. Particularly if it's crossing exam times. So for our GCSE cohort, we know they particularly fall out of the system if they go into temporary accommodation. They miss exams, they tend to do reasonably badly compared to what they could do. But also when children move out of an area, if the school are told they're moved, they quite often come off the school register and they're not in another school and they're literally missing, like nobody really tracks them. So we've got cases, and I know other organisations have got cases of children falling out of school for months, a whole school year at a time, and then popping up somewhere and going back into school. So there's definitely something we could do about tracking children through the education system better that's linked with temporary.
And nobody's got a responsibility at that point at the moment?
I don't think so. From what I know, I'm not an education expert. I hold my hands up. I'm a clinician that's ended up in this world. But from what I can see, nobody seems to have responsibility for them. And there's something about if, in the worst situations, if they're kind of out of sight, out of mind, which is terrible for our children.
Sarah, back to you.
So are there regulations which intend to limit B&B placements for families to 6 weeks fit for purpose in your...
So there are, yes. So we do have regulations around families not being placed in B&Bs for longer than 6 weeks. What we're seeing in those levels go up quite, they have, when you look at the statistics on temporary accommodation, we're seeing an increase in those. And I mentioned this before, but this is often because there are no other options for local authorities to place households. It's still not acceptable, but I think it's a symptom of the kind of overall kind of crisis that we're seeing and an urgency around temporary accommodation in that, it is much better and more cost effective not to use B&Bs, particularly for families with children, but we're in a situation now where we have to. And I think one of the things that's been we've welcomed is the kind of in the Renters' Rights Bill there is kind of provision there that you could look at regulation in terms of temporary accommodation. However, I think regulation on its own isn't going to fix this. So as I've said, we're breaching regulation already. So this isn't out of choice. And until we kind of look at the whole system, so yeah, definitely better, we need better quality temporary accommodation in the short term in order, if that's the only option people have. But we need to look at like what is all the different housing kind of solutions within that system, and kind of investment in short term. So things like, let's look at LHA again to make sure the private rented sector is affordable. Can we look at the benefit cap and review that? Are there other short term fixes on the housing market, like looking at provisions for empty homes and some flexible funding that could bring homes into use very quickly, as well as the longer term kind of investment in social housing. So I think, yes, breach of regulations is happening, but it's got to be looked at in that kind of wider piece.
At the moment, there's no sanctions for breaching to anybody apart from the family. So we don't have league tables. We don't compare local authorities. Local authorities have really difficult job, but there is good practice, and there's definitely less good practice. And there's local authorities who are looking at their temporary accommodation problem in a much more strategic manner than others. And I don't see we're learning particularly across the board. But at the moment, I'm a little bit nervous that it becomes a problem that's unfixable, and therefore, oh well. And actually, it's not unfixable. And we should be holding 6 weeks as the longest. That's a summer holiday. That, if you've got children, that always feels very long. Like, that's long enough to be living in a hotel room.
Just moving on swiftly, just mindful of time. Thank you, Gagan. Looking at out of borough placements, Nashaba.
Also, just declare an interest that I used to work for St Mungo's, who are on the panel today. My question is just about out of area placements. How far outside of area are some of local authorities placing families in temporary accommodation?
So we don't totally know because we don't report it. So that's one thing the government could do, would be say when local authorities send in their returns, to also say where they're placing people out of area. My experience is I've seen families arriving in North Manchester from Camden, just sent up 5 kids. I've seen families arrive up north from all over the country, and I know that we have, as an area, we've also sent families. We had one family who were homeless in Oldham and got sent to Hastings for some bizarre reason. So the distances are huge, but we don't have a national picture because we don't collect the data.
Thank you. And just in terms of that then, it would be interesting to hear what you think the impacts on outcomes are, particularly educational outcomes for children, of those out of area placements. And do you think that there is enough happening within local authorities to minimise this disruption?
I think one of the things that we're seeing, and I suspect is, and the local authorities, you have a kind of hierarchy of money. So Central London generally has a bit more money than out of London. Out of London has a bit more money than the Shires, and then it goes up north, basically. And so you see people move from Central London out to Watford, and then from Watford out a bit further, and it's like a domino effect. We're just moving lots of families along, and that's to do with economics. That feels much more solvable. And we see the same even in a city region like Manchester, Liverpool. We see the same thing happening across areas that are more expensive than less expensive. I think we need to almost we should have an aim of reducing out of our placements down, try and see the graph come down and see the distance comes down. So the impact is massive. For a family, they lose their social connection. You lose all your natural pathways of after-school clubs and anything like that. You lose your mates to come and help you look after the baby and hold it. A lot of kids will make a Herculean effort the first couple of weeks to go to school, and then it drifts off. And the other thing is you lose your place in other public sector services, you lose your place in the NHS, you lose your place in a SEND assessment. Lots of things you just fall out of. And then you end up back at the beginning of the queue again. And if you're moved multiple times, which we do see across local authority areas, that happens to you repeatedly. So it's definitely disruptive, and I don't think we are fully aware of the cost of that.
Just another follow-up question, Chair, if I may. So just in terms of the communication between local authorities, if you, for example, do see that level of movement, do you think that there is enough communication to sort of support and protect children and those being moved out? And do you think, for example, are there enough disincentives in place for an authority not to place out of area? Or do you think it'd rather make it a standard practice rather than an exceptional circumstance?
I'm happy to go first and bring others in. So I think we have local authorities who operate very differently. So there is clearly a difference between kind of high pressured areas versus kind of areas where we may have smaller proportions of out of area placements compared to kind of the numbers of in temporary accommodation. I think there can always be better communication. So I think Laura's really kind of have explained the impact that has on kind of educational needs, and also where people move between placements, and sometimes you can't keep track in terms of what's happening to the family. We work more with single households, but we have increasingly had people with dependent children come to our services. I think that's a direct impact of how much pressure local authorities are under at the moment, and also the scale of homelessness. And I've got a testimony from somebody who we're working with at the moment, who's saying that there's no direct transport links to their son's school. They're having to kind of travel an hour and 30 minutes to get to that school. They're fortunate, they're in work. Their employer has allowed them to work from home more because they can't afford to do they can't afford to do both. I think this is kind of illustrative of a wider problem. So when you were talking about can we limit out of area places, I think yes. I think that would be helpful, because not only does it mean that the responsibility stays within the local authority boundary, it means that better kind of communication happens. I think it also means that there's not a discharge of duty out of that boundary. I think there's definitely positive practice though. So, if you've got kind of groups of local authorities working together, and we do see that both in London and in other parts of the country, there can actually be kind of joint protocols, kind of understanding of kind of where you are placing people and why. Is it to do with kind of looking at what property sizes you have? Is it also about needs? Is it making sure that kind of you have those reciprocal arrangements in place? So there are things that are good practice and work. I think it's just that is not consistent, and so until we see consistency of that, what you end up with is you do have kind of examples where communication has broke down, people have kind of slipped through the kind of radar of lots of different services, and actually that's where you get kind of real, you can have safeguarding issues, but also kind of that's kind of detrimental impact on the household ultimately, and kind of what happens to them over the long term.
Just mindful of time, I've got other colleagues indicating. Joe, very quickly, and Lewis.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on exactly that point. I mean, it's encouraging to hear there might be some best practice around the sort of communications, but could you just explain a bit more what does that look like from the family's perspective, and is there something that could be kind of built out to be more of a standard, or something that could be applied more widely?
So we know that local authorities should tell each other when a child's arriving, but they often don't. And the basic stuff of can we be proactive about getting a child into school? Can we be proactive about getting a child into a GP practice? From a family's perspective, they're often, from their perspective, dumped with very few possessions, somewhere they've never been before. And our organisation supports families very locally to us who arrive in homelessness. And we find that there's some basic stuff that's really helpful to them. Where do they live? How do you get to school? Doing some basic advocacy for them. Have they got the basic equipment they need? And is somebody working with them? Because the housing system is really complicated, and helping them understand what do they do next and what happens next. The other conversation to have is what is likely to happen with families. We often say temporary, but actually when you're honest with them and you say you could be here for months, people will make different decisions than if they think they're moving the next day. And so actually having an honest conversation with families about, if you're going to be here for months or a year, do you want to move your kid to school? That is a decision that parents can then actually take, rather than it always being kind of fobbed off because it might not happen tomorrow. So there's some basic support that can be given.
Do you think that all local authorities have the choice about out of area placements? And the reason why I ask that, because if the centre of London chooses to move out to the outskirts of London, then they push up the prices there, which then prices the outer London boroughs out. They then move out to the shires, so the people in the shires don't have a choice because they can't get it locally, because when they then compete for temporary accommodation, the London Borough is paying more, so they have to go out of borough because the centre of London has chosen to do that. So do you think that all local authorities have a choice about out of area, or do some are forced to do it because other councils are pushing up the prices in their area?
I think the system is incentively going the wrong way. You know, I can see if you're running a local authority at just in like a Luton kind of area, I can see you're under massive pressure from London. That doesn't mean we just precipitate the behaviour up the country. You know, we need to think about it systematically and what's driving that. And is it the kind of no choice? Is it really no choice, or have we not really looked at other options? And so I just challenge, but I desperately don't want this to become an unfixable thing where inevitably everyone gets moved up the country. That's not how we want society to work. I don't want it to be like that.
I think there is something about, so if you have shared outcomes, like what do we want ultimately the outcome to be for households who are at risk of homelessness, and it's not going into temporary accommodation. So what can incentivise a system where you're not what you've just described there is very accurate about what is happening at the moment. So how do we incentivise, you know, a system, a housing and homelessness system that stops that from happening? That's about joint outcomes across government departments. That means that, you know, there isn't this kind of competitive tendering, essentially, which is happening for temporary accommodation at the moment, where whoever pays the highest price wins. We can definitely disincentivise that and look at kind of how you, I suppose, design purposefully kind of, you know, a housing system for low-income households that actually improves outcomes.
And I'm pleased you've mentioned prevention, because we're like 40 minutes in and no one's really spoken about prevention from any of our questions yet, which is the biggest part of, if we prevent people being homeless, that's the best thing we can do, and no one's really touched on that. So
I would say as well that when we talked about what can the government do, it's really positive to see there's this interministerial group. It's about tackling prevention first, then looking at kind of what a housing system should look like and how we move people quickly out of homelessness into settled housing, and then we look at the support, and prevention has got to be key. And in order to stop temporary accommodation going up, if you focus on prevention, like looking at LHA, like looking at kind of the wider prevention and interventions we can make, including affordable housing, then that forces temporary accommodation to come down over the medium to longer term.
Thank you. On to our final question on Sid.
So you've touched on it throughout various questions, but can you just go into a bit more detail around the impacts and potential impacts on children's health of living in TA accommodation?
But at the Stark end, we know that we had 55 children die unexpectedly as a result of living in temporary accommodation, and that work came from our research with the National Child Mortality Database. They will release a next set of data probably early in the new year, and it's likely the figure will go up. Two reasons: we've got more children living in temporary accommodation, and secondly, since we did that original research, they've changed the way that child death reports temporary accommodation, so the coding will be better. So at the harsh end, we get mortality that we don't necessarily need. When you look at child mortality rates, we know that it's massively linked with poverty and insecurity and uncertainty. And so if you look at child mortality rates in some of our most affluent parts of the country, they parallel Norway and the Scandinavian countries. And when you look at child mortality in the poorest areas of our country, they parallel kind of edge of war zone countries. And children in temporary accommodation have a child mortality rate that's really high. If you come back from mortality, then you come back into reduced education attainment. We think there's an increased admission rate from lots of anecdotal evidence we see, but as I said, we don't have the data set for that. We know that children living in temporary accommodation are probably having more accidents, more injuries, and we know that they have this deep sense of insecurity, which affects their attachment and the way they perceive the wider world. So particularly all the early years research about the first 1,000 days is amazing. Humans are amazing, brilliant things, but the foundations we lay down in those early years shape our adult lives. And so when you're talking about economic future, life chances, creative chances, it's massively important that we get these early years right. And similarly for teenagers, we see teenagers who are just completely discombobulated by their whole world being turned upside down by entering temporary accommodation. And then we see lots of knock-on effects of that with their behaviour, with their mental health, with their education achievement. They are likely to end up as neat groups. They're likely to end up having less life chances. And we also know that it's a precursor for homelessness as an adult. So if we can get this, it's worth us as a society really thinking about this properly, and how do we prevent not the harm that's happening now, but also the harm that's going to happen in the future.
Just on that, Emma, you mentioned the task force. How do you think the Department for Health and Social Care should be included in the task force? Because you mentioned the task force earlier.
So, I mean, health is intrinsic to this whole context and the whole prevention agenda. So, and you know, we saw some really interesting stuff during the pandemic, didn't we? Where we brought everybody off the streets because it was a health emergency, and so we solved rough sleeping because you bring people inside and you can work with them as well and help solve their homelessness. I was going to mention the adult point. I mean, almost all my clients will have had some kind of childhood trauma. You know, and as I said at the beginning, homelessness is the end point, so you've got to kind of prevent it happening in the first place. But childhood trauma is often one of the factors that leads people down all different pathways. And I think what's happening, what we're in danger of seeing here is a whole generation of children who are being brought up without a stable home, with everything very precarious, no sense of what it is to live in a stable home with going to the same school the whole time and you know, living healthily. And guess what? We'll see it come out in adulthood. We absolutely will.
Rebecca, and then I'm going to bring in Sarah and then Lee to finish quickly.
So we see a lot of frontline evidence of this in our work every day. In hostels, families are living in a single room. So you have everybody, mum, dad, siblings, everyone in one room. What that's doing to children is, firstly, they can't develop their gross motor skills. They haven't got the space to learn to crawl, to learn to walk. There's nowhere to store toys, so they can't play, which we all know play is foundational to childhood development, but also to well-being. And they're just not getting those opportunities in an overcrowded room that has every possession that family owns. So inevitably, parents rely a lot on screen time to keep the children occupied, and so they're therefore very sedentary, and that can cause health problems as well. We've mentioned lack of proper cooking facilities, so parents are, and also space to store food and to refrigerate food, so people are very reliant on takeaways, and so they're not having healthy diets as a result of that. All of that affects their physical well-being. But in terms of their mental well-being, again, the lack of ability to play, they're not getting to develop cognitively, they're not getting that opportunity to make sense of the world and to let off steam and make sense of their experiences. It's causing huge social isolation. They don't get to develop their social skills with peers. And they're also, a hostel room is like a pressure cooker. You are subject to your parental stress 24/7, and parents also can't get away from each other, from their children, and the impact on the mental health of people all living in one room like that is quite severe.
Sarah, really quick, and then Lee to finish. Just running over time a bit.
Just interested about the panel's awareness of the kind of the economic impact that's been, as the research been undertaken to demonstrate the wider economic impact of failing to act on this issue to that whole family, to the children's future, etc., etc.
I think there's pockets of study. What we know is that as a society we're spending a lot of money on these families for really, really, excuse my language, crap outcomes, like we are. They're very expensive families. We're pouring resources in just in a really inappropriate way. We do know the link between homelessness as a child and homelessness as an adult. We know the link between homelessness as a child and education attainment. We know the link between homelessness as a child and mental health problems because of what Rebecca's explained, that pressure cooker environment. So we do know it. We do know some of the economic impacts. We're also starting to understand the economic impact on families themselves. So there's a piece of research that was published a couple of weeks ago that showed that just being in temporary accommodation increases your debt because you're having to pay for takeaways, having to pay for extra charges you didn't expect, having to commute more. Everything's more expensive if you're living precariously in one room. And we also know that that debt is then stopping people moving on in their housing journey. So sometimes really small numbers of debt, like £500 arrears somewhere in your history, is stopping you being able to bid for your next bit of housing. So that's something as well that the research is showing that we could look at as a policy angle as well.
Well, I think the answer is already no because of what you were saying, Dr. Neilson, around coding, for example. But is it your view how does the government effectively monitor the health impacts of temporary accommodation through data it collects from local authorities? Does anyone have a view on that?
I'd like to see the NHS choose to see homeless children as a health issue, and I'd like to see them come to the table. They were invited to the OPG several times. We haven't seen senior NHS colleagues come. If we start, at least let's make them visible in the NHS system, because if they're visible, we count them, we can track them, we'll be able to put better health care around them.
Okay. And then just to declare, I'm on the APPG for temporary accommodation, which is in my main declaration.
Thank you very much. Really insightful session this morning from our guests. Really a lot of thought for there. I think the key thing is around the amount of children that are going to spend the next few weeks in temporary accommodation. So thank you very much to our guests. We'll have a handover to our next set of witnesses. Could just introduce themselves, then we'll start off with questions. I'll start off with you, Chris.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Hancock. I'm the Head of Housing at Hastings Borough Council.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Hannah Courtney-Adamson. I'm the Head of Strategic Housing Services at Rochdale Borough Council.
Good morning. I'm Hannah Dalton. I'm the District Council's Network Spokesperson on Housing and Homelessness.
Good morning. I'm Councillor Grace Williams. I'm Leader of Waltham Forest and Deputy Chair for London Councils with responsibility for housing.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Lewis.
Thank you. I'd just say that I have been previously a board member on the DCN and I'm a Hertfordshire County Councillor, but they don't have responsibility for homelessness and housing. So we'll come to you first, Chris. Hastings, 50% of your budget on temporary accommodation. How sustainable is that? What are you doing as an authority to try and get that down?
So, short answer, response to the first question: not sustainable. We can't continue to spend that proportion of what is a small borough council's
just give us a
budget.
flavour. Sorry to interrupt you. What is your annual budget then? Just to give us a flavour about.
So net, we're talking around 18 million. So,
right, okay.
And we're spending, we're forecast to spend this year about 6.8 million on on temporary accommodation, which is completely unsustainable, and it means that there are lots of things we can't do as a borough outside of housing that we would want to do for residents. What we're doing around that, we've benefited a lot from external capital funding that we've received from government, and we are acquiring properties in the market to use as temporary accommodation. It is so much more cost effective for us to own the temporary accommodation, and also there's a benefit, all the things that we heard from the previous panel around adverse experiences in temporary accommodation, we can try and rectify those if we own the accommodation. We can allow pets, we can have your own front door, people can decorate, they can have visitors, all these things that are very difficult in privately procured temporary accommodation. But the issue is exacerbated. The subsidy that we receive to help us pay for that private temporary accommodation is still pegged to 2011 local housing allowance figures. The rental market in Hastings has transformed beyond description between 2011 and 2024. If the subsidy amount was pegged to the 2024 figures, we would have an additional 1.4 million in income, which would be transformative given what I've said about the size of our budget. So we are moving in the right direction with this acquisitions, probably, but people are still in need of the service and still in need of temporary accommodation. So the challenge very much remains.
And then Grace, lots of London councils decide to move people in temporary accommodation outside of London, which obviously puts pressure on the home counties. Why do you think London boroughs choose to do that?
So, I think, first of all, thank you for the question. Probably the word decide is not strictly accurate here. So, London is at the centre of the housing crisis. At the moment, it's London that's facing the brunt of temporary accommodation pressures. No borough wants to place people outside its own borough. We know that outcomes for people, particularly children, are better if they're in borough. The reason this is happening, and I think the previous panel really demonstrated this, is we have this national crisis where, I think, as you said before, what happens in London becomes a knock-on effect in other places. But essentially, what's happening is London councils are at the point where housing, temporary accommodation. Temporary accommodation makes up 75% of their spend on housing. So we're at the situation now where we simply can't sustain housing within our boroughs. So the reason this is happening is because we don't have enough affordable housing. That's the main thing. And then I think also Chris has already referred to the resources point. So if we don't have enough money for families to afford to stay, either through the local housing allowance that we just referred to, or the fact that the cap is pegged to 2011 levels, we don't have enough resources to help our families to stay in the capital. Regardless of that, actually about 90% of placements still are in London. So local London boroughs are not trying to force people out. They want people to stay in the capital. But we do recognise now that we are in emergency times, and we do need to work together to find some solutions. One of the things we're really pushing for is for us to talk about it nationally, to recognise that this opportunity of the homelessness strategy should be our chance to have a national system which is fair, where we do have decent data, where we do have national standards, and we do recognise the relationship between London and the rest of the country.
And I suppose an open question to you all around, we've had the budget, they've said that the local housing rates are not going to increase. What do you think is, how is that going to impact on local governments in terms of their budgets, and how many councils do you reckon are getting to the point, a bit like Hastings, where it is becoming incredibly too much pressure on their budgets and tip over that into that not having enough money for day-to-day expenditure?
I mean, speaking from the District Council's network, I mean, at the moment the housing benefit subsidy covers just 38% of the costs. So that means that councils have an average shortfall of around £1.1 million. That's fundamentally unsustainable, and is just meaning that councils are having to absorb these costs. They're having to divert money that they should be putting into the preventative measures that they want to put in place to then support temporary accommodation. And I think when it comes to LHA, that then creates a double financial pressure, because we've got to fund expensive TA. And I'm also a leader of Epsom and York Borough Council, and as an example, in the last 6 months, temporary accommodation has gone up from £90 a night to over £130 a night. So then we're having to cover the gap between LHA and the actual cost. And it's just ever increasing cost that is unsustainable for us to continue to fund. And as was mentioned in the previous panel, we all want to do preventative work. Nobody wants to see their residents in a situation where they're homeless, but we're not able to do that because of the spiralling costs.
I think I'll just come in there if that's okay. I think a lot of the capital investment that's come from government over the last 4 to 6 years, which is really welcomed, as Chris has said, has been focused on our single homelessness households, and I think it's fair to say that our families, which is proportionally the bigger percentage of homelessness, has been neglected, which has meant local authorities have been in a response and reactive position when those families are hitting the front door, as opposed to taking that more strategic upstream approach. I think there is something certainly to be looked at around the housing benefit legislation. That is in government's power to review that, to ensure when, you know, it's a statutory responsibility for local authorities to provide temporary accommodation, and the way we fund a big proportion of that is we recover that back through housing benefit, but because of the subsidy rules, they're punitive towards local authorities. So you've got one part of the system that we legally have to deliver this, but the other part of the system that actually penalises local authorities financially. So I definitely think that's an area that could be looked at when there's a review of temporary accommodation and how that is delivered.
And then just lastly, thank you. When you get capital money as councils, then how agile do you think councils are to be able to, because I've been a councillor, they get given money to deliver capital projects. We have loads of meetings about stuff, spades go in the ground a couple of years later. And if councils became more agile when you got that capital money, particularly around homelessness, to either build accommodation or what have you, people would face better life outcomes. So do you think there's a lot more that councils can do to be a bit more agile, rather than just taking the capital money, coming up with a meeting, having a plan about it and not delivering for a couple of years?
Can I just come in firstly? So in London, London councils have a really good track record of building affordable homes, and we've really started to get to grips with building social homes. But the issue that we've seen, because you're right, there's still been a gap in the homes that we need to afford, is because of costs. So it's not so much about our flexibility or our willingness to build, it's the fact that we don't have the resources to meet the viability gap, and that viability gap has come from increasing costs of construction, increasing costs of planning that are making it really difficult. And then you add to that the costs that residents face in terms of their mortgage rates or their rent. So for us it's a viability challenge, which is why we're really pleased to see the government put a lot more extra money into the affordable homes programme. We don't know what that means yet for each local authority, but it is about the ability to fund social and affordable homes that will make the biggest difference. Planning reform will not do it alone.
I know Chris wanted to come in quickly.
Just to Hannah Dalton. When you've had the points here about LHA going up, I sort of see that in the sort of pernicious impact that's caused on increasing TA and increasing your costs on that. When you've had conversations with the department or people related, what kind of response have you got from them? And I suppose, sort of following on from that, I suppose you'd argue it would be beneficial to have long-term knowledge of the direction of travel of LHA, not the 1 year next year settlement. Can you sort of talk about how that might allow councils to do future planning, which could then have a positive impact?
I certainly, for district councils, having a better understanding of what our funding is over a longer term enables to better plan and to better understand how we can spend our money. But I think at the same point, even with that knowledge, because the increase is so sharp in the number of people that are facing this situation, there are more systemic things that need to be done and to address this whole issue as a kind of whole systems issue, because I think as mentioned before, there's planning, there's also the benefits, the subsidy cap, then there's LHA, then there's everything else. So I think it's, welcome the fact that the Deputy Prime Minister has set up the task force, but I think we need to look at all of it in the round, and I'm happy to share after this meeting sort of the ask of the District Council network, because it's a multifaceted ask we'd have to enable us to start to address these issues.
Thank you.
Just to add to that very briefly, I think there's a really good understanding by ministers and by the Deputy Prime Minister the problems that we're facing in terms of the LHA and in terms of the short-term rent settlements that we've had, and we've seen that movement in this budget, and we've seen a real appetite from government to continue working with us. So the consultation on the 5-year rent settlement is really important. So I think there is an understanding, but we also understand as councils that we're dealing with an extremely difficult set of decisions, and that's why we're really keen to work together to find solutions and to do that on a national basis.
No, thank you. Moving on to the quality of temporary accommodation, Joe.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, quality, obviously, all of us will have constituents that are concerned about quality of temporary accommodation. So just an open question initially for the panel, how effective do you think local authorities currently are at monitoring the quality of the temporary accommodation that you're using?
I think we could always be better with that. We don't use bed and breakfast accommodation for families, and we don't make very many out of area placements, very, very small numbers, and only in emergency situations. But that comes at a cost, the cost that I mentioned earlier. In order to keep families within the borough and to keep that accommodation of quality, it does cost. And we are also paying an additional amount for the management of those properties as well when it's within the private sector. So that's where we're getting the accountability on the quality, because we're commissioning it, and therefore we're following up, how's our money being spent, what's the standard of the accommodation. Also, I think feedback directly from the residents of the accommodation is key. There are a number of services within Hastings where families can go for laundry facilities, communal dinners, and so on and so forth. And so we can, be part of those conversations, not, pushing our way in, but be part of those conversations and hear directly from residents, what their concerns are.
I guess I would start with saying that we can't overestimate the impact this is having on residents. It's absolutely detrimental. So that question about quality is really important, and we don't have the perfect answer to it. In London, most boroughs are working together on something called setting the standards, which is us sharing information about where we do have concerns about particular properties, and that helps us to set standards. So there is some good practice, but it's really not ideal because we're starting from the point of what our duties are. So, you know, we need to make sure that we find suitable accommodation. And I think you've heard very clearly from the earlier panel that that suitable accommodation, if you're looking at physical and psychological safety, does not exist. So I think there could be work done to strengthen.
So how would your housing officers respond if a family was rejecting a TA placement because they saw mould or rats or evidence of all the stuff that we will be seeing in our inboxes? How would your housing officers deal with that situation?
That was a family was to complain about their standard of temporary accommodation, then that would be reviewed. They could also ask for a review under the under housing legislation. But I have to say, you know, I think for me, for Rochdale, I'm glad to see that we do have good standard of accommodation. We use dispersed, self-contained properties, although I caveat that we are using bed and breakfast currently due to the overspill with the demand. But I think for me that is around creating a framework, so there's inconsistencies, so some local authorities do that. You could use the Article 4 with your housing standards, and I think that's what's lacking. There hasn't been a national framework or standards set for temporary accommodation, and I think that's where local authorities are really seeking out that guidance and direction from national government to be able to ensure that we've got that good standard of accommodation on a national front.
I'm getting a lot of interest in this. Very quickly, Lee and Nishaba, then back to Joe.
In particular, you mentioned how Hastings operate. Is that you as the head of service giving that direction, or is that an approved council policy or process for placements within TA that's gone before councillors and had that buy-in?
Yes, that is very much the political steer, is that we need to keep people in the borough and we need to maintain the quality of temporary accommodation. But as I said, that comes at a cost, and I think there does come a point where pressures rise and those other options start to be explored, and it makes for very difficult decisions. And
just to declare an interest, I'm a unitary councillor, as we're in a council session.
And then back to Joe.
Hannah's actually answered the question that I had, which was just around having some standards and guidance, because what I see in my inbox, and often from not placements from within the borough, are that there is an inconsistency in standards. So it's just to understand whether you feel that would, whether you feel that this is being applied across the board, across local authorities, or if there is that inconsistency. But I think you picked that up.
I'll just come in as well, if that's all right. We do, and just hearing the previous panel as well, we actually have, and this is Rochdale Council have it, but all the 10 local authorities of Greater Manchester that makes up the combined authority have this. So we have a procurement strategy, so we have a temporary accommodation procurement strategy and a temporary accommodation allocation strategy that outlines exactly what we're referring to here, what we should be offering for families and single homeless households, and the standards. So we do have a section of that around standards of accommodation, picking up on some of the health detrimental impact elements as well. So and also earlier it was again quite reassuring to hear that we don't do this, so we keep our families and single homelessness separate. Again, I'll caveat that occasionally some bed and breakfast will accept other single homeless households, and that's where we can't necessarily control that environment, but our commissioned formal temporary accommodation is separate.
Just to kind of dig further on the sort of sanctions and accountability for poor standards, and Grace, you mentioned the setting standards scheme, which might be useful to understand a bit more if that is working. Are there actually rogue landlords that have been identified and then blacklisted across councils? But also if anyone else wants to come in and question about particularly the rogue landlords.
So setting standards does enable us to do that and to make sure that we are commissioning better property. I mean, I guess I'd start from the point that remembering that all councils, no matter what political shade they are, want to do their best for residents. They want them to be in borough, they want them to have high quality accommodation. I think the reason you're hearing the caveats is we're all working really hard to try to get those standards, but we're at the point where that isn't sustainable. I mean, just to offer a few solutions though, we've talked about resources, and that's really important. The other thing that's really good to see is the government's work on the renters reform bill, because that may offer protections for tenants, so it will mean that local authorities will be able to enforce better for private landlords, because quite a lot of the sector we're talking about isn't just B&Bs and hotels, it is private landlords. So that's really important. And the other thing is discretionary licensing schemes and making those easier. So there are some things we can do to make those standards better.
I think one of the things from the last panel was around inspections. As MPs, we all receive various emails, videos, pictures. A lot of these will then be online, where tenants and families have just lost all faith and despair. They're having to resort to publicly naming and shaming. It shouldn't have to get like that. Do you feel that councils should be doing inspections of their properties, because millions of taxpayers' money has been spent on this, but yet these properties are not inspected? Do any of your councils carry out regular inspections of where you're placing families?
Yeah, so Rochdale Council, we do that. Our housing standards team do that as standard practice. So any new accommodation, and then it's reviewed every 12 months. One thing that we also do that isn't, again, it's not consistent, but all our bed and breakfast, so they are inspected as well. So actually our commercial hotels, if they're fully booked with homeless households, they actually should be registered as a HMO and they should be licensed. So we have local authorities have the enforcement powers to enforce that. That is something that Rochdale Council do. So our bed and breakfast that we use, albeit they still look like a commercial bed and breakfast hotel, they're actually registered HMOs and licensed, and that comes with the conditions, and if they breach that, again, we can prosecute, but it's not consistent. So I think that's something we've done because it's a political stay and a corporate stay, and it's the right thing to do. However, it's not consistent, and that's why you're seeing obviously a high volume of complaints.
Just to come in on that point, we also carry out inspections and will choose not to use certain accommodation, which we know that other councils then may be forced to use. I think one of the challenges that we probably all recognise is that with the rapid number of placements we're having to make, along with the reduced environmental health and capacity that many councils have, it's a real struggle at times to do that. And we're also in a situation where the worst accommodation, temporary accommodation, is actually the one where we have least powers to address those situations. So I think, again, that national TA quality framework would really help us and give us a framework to address some of the issues that the Chair has mentioned, because none of us want to place residents or children in poor accommodation, but sometimes the choice genuinely could be, are they going to be on the street or do they have a roof over their head? And it may not be the best roof, and it's not a roof we're happy with, but it's a really, really difficult choice. And the thing is, our teams are having to make this choice every day, and therefore the people working in housing support, it's just incredibly difficult, and they are having to make poor, tough choices every day just to be able to provide some accommodation.
I think, can I just add as well, and that apologies, the other issue around that is Home Office, so the accommodation provider for asylum dispersal accommodation, they're exempt from some of these rules, which again, so they're rogue landlords say, sorry, we don't want you because the accommodation provider is going to offer 20% more, so we're in direct competition. I appreciate, obviously, that's another area, but that again is a lack of joined up policy at National Home Office and MHLG not joined up with the policy and how they deliver accommodation. So again, that needs looking at around the standards. We're going to create a temporary accommodation framework that needs to be with asylum dispersal as well.
We're going to have to pick up pace a bit. Maybe if you hold on to that. Just going to B&B accommodation. Back to you, Sarah.
Thanks. And what can local authorities do to minimise the number of families being placed in B&B accommodation, and particularly the number that are being placed for extended periods?
Well, we talked about it in the earlier panel around prevention. The earlier that we know that somebody is threatened with homelessness, the more time we've got to try and come up with another option to try and avoid that happening and that move into bed and breakfast, because we would only really ever need that emergency accommodation if we didn't have that foresight of somebody coming in, and it was just that approach on the day. So prevention, but also having the means to be able to provide an alternative form of accommodation, so being able to find something that's at local housing allowance rate in the private rented sector, or, as I mentioned earlier, something that properties that we're buying up ourselves that we can offer as temporary accommodation directly. That will be the main way that we're avoiding the need for any emergency accommodation.
I'm guess I'd add to that. So just remembering that figure that at the moment in London, London boroughs are spending 75% of their budget on temporary accommodation. So that squeeze on resources is really important. You know, how do we address that? And seeing that extra money in the budget for homelessness prevention is important. But we have to put this alongside what the ultimate problem is, which is building more affordable homes. So we need to do both those things. And then I think the other thing we need to do is, and I think there was a focus on this in the first session, where we are seeing families who are going into debt, who are being evicted, we need to be working with them. So we've seen recently a high number of private landlords leaving the market through a combination of things which we touched on. We actually need to be working with those families where there is an eviction. At the moment, the current system sort of means that local authorities can only help a family the day that they become homeless. That's the statutory duty. So reforming that and increasing resources for prevention are really important.
And I'm glad.
So just to clarify, you said 75% of your budget is spent on housing. Of the whole council budget?
So not my budget, but London Council's budget. 75% of all local authority spending on homelessness is spent on TA.
Social care and things?
Sorry, of our housing budget.
Right.
Yeah, so but I would just underline that at the moment we're in a situation where temporary accommodation has become the number one pressure for London councils over and above adult and children's social care. So we're at the stage now where a number of boroughs are facing bankruptcy just on this one issue.
Sarah, please.
I could see some sort of different views potentially at the end of the panel on the previous question, but I'm glad that you mentioned that issue, because I've certainly experienced it myself in casework, where basically families are not getting the support until they are evicted. Now I'm getting the perspective that maybe that's not how all councils are operating. I'd be interested to bring other panel members in on...
Yeah, so sorry, the legal duty is actually to prevent within 56 days of homelessness, so we should be working with somebody up to 56 days before they're actually, and then it's the relief. But I think probably where we're getting at is because of the sheer volume and local authorities are inundated, got high unsafe caseloads, they're probably saying, sit tight, we'll work with you when you're at the acute crisis. Well, what should we do is going upstream. Something where piloting is working with our early help services, our early help to teams and children. So we have probably what you know as Sure Start centres, our family hubs. So we're upskilling all our family workers with housing knowledge, so that if they are coming in and starting to talk about housing or getting into debt, rent arrears, then that we're actually working with them at an earlier stage as opposed to hitting crisis. I think for me that's something from a housing lens. The housing needs assessment through the homelessness system doesn't account for the health and educational needs of a child or the whole family as a whole. And again, I think that's probably something that could be reviewed through the housing legislation around when you are being assessed. At that prevention element, how do we take the whole household into account through an integrated model as opposed to those siloed? And I guess that's the way funding works as well. And then just lastly, picking up on the deficit, so we have a 2 million deficit due to the bed and breakfast subsidy loss. That's been, obviously we're having to find that out of corporate funding, but fundamentally that's coming out of children's and adult care budgets to offset that deficit. So that's the impact. But equally, homelessness is a symptom of the wider system failing, isn't it?
Thank you. And I think we've slightly covered this, but are the current financial penalties for exceeding the 6-week rule an effective sanction to improve temporary accommodation provision, or are there other levers that could be implemented to try and tackle that?
I mean, I think the financial penalties are actually counterproductive for district councils who are already facing on average shortfalls of 1 million a year annually. So it just simply diverts money away from the prevention and support service the panel's already mentioned. And also there's not a lack of motivation to move families on. It really genuinely is a lack of suitable accommodation that's available, and that coupled with the rising demand. I think a more constructive approach that certainly District Council Network would suggest is that we provide resources that develop alternative accommodation options. We've mentioned before capital funding, which would then help councils to build their own temporary accommodation stock that longer term meets the needs. And also, provides the children who are in this situation with a settled place to be, somewhere that they can call home.
Just moving on to out of borough and out of area placements, Nashaba.
Thank you, Chair. I think this question has already been raised and some conversation has already happened on it in terms of why the pressures exist across London and the South East, so thank you for answering that. I think I just wanted to do a bit of a follow-up because I've seen some FOI data which suggests that some boroughs are close to about 3,000 households that they're sending out of borough. It would just be helpful to understand if you feel that the communications between boroughs is sufficient, whether you feel that particularly vulnerable families that are being placed outside of their home borough, that they're getting that there is enough work done to assure and receive reassurance that there is the services in the area they're being moved to in place to support them, particularly children. So it just helps one to understand that.
Yeah, I mean, legally, a local authority should notify the hosting authority through a Section 208. However, I think it's fair to say local authorities don't do that consistently and it isn't regulated, it isn't measured. So I don't think, in fact, we don't submit that to central government with our data, so government are not measuring us on that. So I think to answer your question in short, no, I think there needs to be more done on that. What that 208 doesn't do, doesn't inform education, children, health, it doesn't inform the wider system. So if there's safeguarding, child protection or unmet support needs, that hosting authority will not know until that family or individual hits the front door of, example, hospital or GP, school, etc. So I think there is definitely a lot more, and I think that can come through an out-of-borough protocol framework. You could regulate with the measure the legislation. Greater Manchester, we do, the 10 local authorities of Greater Manchester, we're signed up to an out-of-borough protocol, which we've just reviewed actually as the 10 collective, to ensure that something we don't actually do is we do place out of borough, but it's all within the Greater Manchester region, so we don't go further. However, in the north we are receiving obviously a lot of the southern local authorities because we're a cheaper stock area, so obviously it's far cheaper and cost effective to send people, but the impact on the wider system and long term, I'm not sure that is value for money.
I think three things would really help. I think a mandatory notification system would help us to ensure that councils are alerted when families are being placed in their areas by other authorities. That doesn't currently happen. Standardised protocols for cross-boundary placements would also help us to manage moves, and I think better data sharing between councils around available accommodation and what support services would really help. So being able to provide more wraparound support by having better, earlier notification and information would make a massive difference.
Thank you. Okay, just moving on swiftly, looking at wraparound support. Chris.
Thanks, Chair. So, what wider support services should local authorities provide residents while they're living in temporary accommodation?
That's a really good question. So, I mean, obviously, speaking for London councils, there'll be a wide variety of practice that's going on, but we have seen some really good practice, and that includes things like, for example, in our borough, we have just commissioned some new accommodation which will be refitted to have standalone kitchens for every room, which will make a big difference for us. So I think, you know, using the accommodation we've got but making sure that it's suitable is really important. In terms of support services, we need to recognise that we have that responsibility to be helping with things like education, welfare, and things like sort of how we can provide cooking facilities and laundry facilities. And there is some really good practice going on in some boroughs, and I think it's how we make it standard and how we make sure that there is that resource for the wraparound support that would make a big difference.
I suppose, in particular, if anybody's got any thoughts to add on schools, and what sort of best practice, what's the limits that people have in order to have best practice on ensuring children have the support they need in schools, ensuring children are able to get to schools, what are the challenges that are faced there, and what works, and why isn't everyone else doing what works?
I think there's two things. That's the financial pressure on that, so local authorities don't have the resource to be able to invest in a service to allow to do that. I think schools, it's obviously teachers are not trained in that wider taking the homelessness and housing, so I think it really ranges on demographics of that school, the pockets. So if you've got a really, deprived area, perhaps that school may be more equipped to deal with homelessness, families that are experiencing homelessness if they've got pastoral teams. But again, that's inconsistent. So I think that for me probably goes back to the early help assessments around how do we ensure that we've got this integrated whole assessment, looking at the whole family and the child. They are just a number, and I think we've dehumanised that, and I think we need to bring that back to that person-centred approach. That is something that we are piloting, as I said earlier, in Rochdale, but again, it's not standardised, and I think that's where we really need to get to that granular detail around what we need to do to be able to make that best practice across the board.
So, just ask, as somebody who works in the local council now, we've obviously moved from a situation where most of the schools I assume you're dealing with, particularly secondary schools, are academies. How do you find it working with them? Is it an incredibly mixed bag? Do you find some are really supportive? Do you find there's some groups that really don't want to engage on this? Or
Yeah, I think again it's inconsistent, and I think that has definitely contributed around the academies. Obviously they have their own budgets, but I think what I can say locally is actually we have a better engagement with our academy schools as opposed to our public schools, and I think that again goes down to resource and the pressures, and I think it is actually quite often it's dependent on an officer having that professional curiosity as opposed to this is the framework, this is what we follow in that integrated approach. I don't know if that answers your question.
Just one quickly. So I think it's about leadership, not about structure. So in London and in our borough, actually, school leaders, regardless of whether academies or maintained schools, should see this as their business, as should the NHS. And I think there it is about local authority leadership of saying, this is a safeguarding issue we need to work on together. Wandsworth in particular, I just wanted to highlight their best practice, that's what I was looking for. They have a housing multi-agency safeguarding hub officer who works with schools, so he talks to schools about the housing issues and helps signpost to support. So there are real models out there, and they are about partnership and making sure that we're all taking responsibility together.
Just moving Joe and Sarah really quickly,
I know for a lot of families they're desperate to maintain the local links, and that's partly then you have these long commutes to school and then absenteeism and so on. And it's a link, just linking it to a previous discussion we had about being honest about the time people might be spending. Are you encouraging your housing officers to have those frank conversations so people can make better decisions?
The figures are there to show people how long the wait will be for certain sizes of properties, and right down to certain streets and locations. So if people are saying I need to be living in this area, then we can show, well, the last time a property came up here, this was the amount of time somebody waited who was successful with it. So you can have those sort of very, they are challenging conversations, because you're not always giving the information. You're not giving good news because the wait times will be considerable. But that is available, and I think it's also then prompts other wider conversations. Well, if that wait is not not palatable, not acceptable, then can we help you look at the private rented sector? Can we look at something different as an option? But yeah, we do have those very frank conversations, and they do help in the prevention context as well. Just the reality of how the system works and how long waits are does mean that people then consider other options.
Sarah.
Slightly broader question. Obviously, we've heard a lot about the best practice examples this morning. And I'm interested, as much as, you did make the point that this is a problem equally shared across councils of all different political colours, etc. But clearly some are doing this better than others. And I'm interested in what we think the drivers are within the councils and the local authorities where they are not performing well, where there are high numbers going out of area and, probably worse impact on these children and families. What are potentially the drivers that are happening within those local authorities that are not, I guess, working at the level that maybe some of the panel councils represent?
I think I'd start with resources. So, if you look at the boroughs where we're seeing higher numbers of people having to leave the capital, or higher numbers in bed and breakfast accommodation, which are two really important indicators, it is about the level of temporary accommodation demand in those areas. But it isn't only about that. It is about leadership. It is about having a joined up approach, which is why I think we're all heartened to see the homelessness strategy and task force address that. So those would be the three big things for me.
I also would add, I think historically homelessness has been seen very much as a London or a metropolitan issue. I think for a lot of councils the very rapid increase in the number of people presenting as homeless has they haven't been able to pivot fast enough, and I think a lot of councils have presumed that at some point it will go back down, and it isn't, and it's increasing year on year on year, and the complexity with it, mentioned before, you've got families, but then you've got people with single complex needs, and then the amount of accommodation available and finding it and having a strategy around it. I just think that for some councils it is literally a tsunami that they are now having to get to grips with. It's not only that, for example, I was talking to our housing support manager the other day. They've spent 30 years doing this. They've never seen it like this. And only recently an expectant mother lost their child and now blames the council for the temporary accommodation and her miscarriage. That puts a huge amount of pressure on employees, on individuals, to come to work and do that job every day, when what they've always wanted to do is the best for people. So I think it's, the impact on the families involved is actually unquantifiable. We can quantify it for councils, but I think we also are having to start to quantify it, for councils rather in terms of cost and spend, but I think we're also having to start to quantify what it is on the impact on our teams to be able to deliver these services to support these families.
Thank you very much. We've had a really meaningful and insightful conversation. I think the reality is everything we've discussed this morning isn't new. If we look back at the 2019 commission from the Children's Commissioner, where they plainly said it's simply inappropriate places that children are having to grow up. I think my worry is that the situation continues to get worse, if not better, and it's a case of how we work with local authorities in terms of the level of accommodation, the state of the accommodation. Sometimes it's not just about funding, it's about that wraparound support for families. We are actively placing young people in accommodation that's not suitable. So something around the standards and the regulation needs to be looked at. And these are all issues we're going to continue to discuss, especially with the Secretary of State and her ministers, in terms of making sure we get this right so we don't fail a generation of young people. But thank you very much for coming to give evidence to us this morning. Thank you. Order, order.